The slap echoed through Coastal Kitchen like a gunshot, silencing every conversation in the packed restaurant. Vivian Grace Morrison sat frozen, her hand instinctively moving to her reddening cheek as her wire-rimmed glasses clattered to the marble floor. 7 months pregnant and glowing despite her exhaustion. She stared across the white linen tablecloth at her husband Charles, whose face remained cold and calculating even after striking her in front of 50 witnesses. "Pick them up," Charles Edward Whitmore III commanded in the same tone he used with subordinates at his investment firm. His steel gray eyes held no remorse, only irritation that she had forced his hand. "And stop making that pathetic face. People are staring." The upscale restaurant had fallen eerily quiet except for the soft jazz playing over hidden speakers and the gentle crash of waves against the rocks outside. Coastal Kitchen sat perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering breathtaking views that normally made this the most sought-after reservation in town. Tonight, those windows reflected the stunned faces of diners who had witnessed something that would haunt them for weeks. Vivian's hands trembled as she bent forward awkwardly, her pregnant belly making the simple task of retrieving her glasses nearly impossible. The baby kicked frantically inside her, as if responding to her elevated heart rate and the surge of adrenaline coursing through her system. She had felt this before, the way her unborn child seemed to sense danger, even from within the safety of her womb. "Happy anniversary to us," Charles murmured, straightening his Italian silk tie and reaching for his wineglass as if nothing had happened. At 38, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. Old money family, Ivy League education, corner office with harbor views, and a pregnant wife who had learned to keep her mouth shut. Until tonight. The evening had started like so many others over their 3 years of marriage. Charles had chosen the restaurant, ordered for both of them without consulting her preferences, and spent the first course detailing her failures as a wife and soon-to-be mother. Her weight gain during pregnancy disgusted him. Her inability to keep up with his social obligations embarrassed him. Her suggestion that she might need to take maternity leave earlier than planned had triggered his coldest rage. "The doctor said the stress levels could affect the baby," Vivian had whispered, hoping to make him understand. "My blood pressure has been elevated, and she's concerned about preterm labor if I don't slow down." Charles had gripped her wrist under the table then, his manicured fingers pressing against her pulse point until she gasped. "You will work until this baby comes, and you will do it with a smile on your face. Do you understand me? I will not have my wife looking weak in front of my colleagues and clients." That was when she had made her mistake. Instead of nodding and apologizing like she had been trained to do over months of systematic conditioning, Vivian had found a spark of her old self buried deep beneath layers of fear and compliance. "I am not your employee, Charles. I am your wife, and I am carrying your child. I deserve some consideration and respect." The words had hung in the air between them for exactly 3 seconds before his palm connected with her cheek. Now, as she finally managed to retrieve her glasses with the help of a concerned waiter, Vivian became aware of the phones pointed in their direction. In an age where everything was recorded and shared instantly, Charles had just destroyed any chance of maintaining his carefully crafted public image. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized he did not care. The mask had finally slipped completely. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disturbance," Charles announced to the room, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling narratives. "My wife is having some difficulty with her pregnancy hormones. I am sure you all understand." The collective intake of breath was audible, even in a room full of wealthy, powerful people who were accustomed to overlooking uncomfortable truths. Charles had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Several women pushed back from their tables, hands moving protectively to their own bellies or reaching for their companions. Vivian felt the familiar shame washing over her, the voice in her head that Charles had carefully cultivated, telling her this was somehow her fault. She should not have spoken back. She should not have embarrassed him in public. She should have been more careful, more submissive, more grateful for the privilege of carrying his heir. But the baby kicked again, harder this time, and something deeper than fear stirred in her chest. This tiny person growing inside her did not deserve to enter a world where violence was explained away as hormonal difficulties. This child deserved better than a father who solved problems with his fists and a mother too afraid to protect them both. "Charles," she said quietly, her voice stronger than she felt. "I think we should go home." "We will leave when I decide we leave," he replied, cutting into his perfectly prepared duck breast as if the last 5 minutes had not occurred. "And you will finish your meal and act like the grateful wife you are supposed to be." That was when Vivian noticed him approaching their table. Clayton Mitchell Grace moved through the dining room with the purposeful stride of someone who had spent years navigating war zones and hostile territory. At 32, her older brother still carried himself like the Navy SEAL he had been before trading his military career for Chef White's and a dream of opening his own restaurant. His dark hair was shorter than military regulation, but longer than he had worn it overseas, and his green eyes held the kind of focused intensity that made smart people step aside and stupid people make very bad decisions. Clay had built Coastal Kitchen from nothing, transforming a rundown seafood shack into the most prestigious restaurant on the Central Coast through sheer force of will and culinary genius. He treated his staff like family, his customers like honored guests, and his sister like the most precious thing in his world. Tonight, he looked like he was preparing for war. "Vivian," Clay said softly as he reached their table, his voice carrying the controlled calm that any veteran would recognize as a warning signal. His eyes moved quickly over her reddened cheek, her trembling hands, her defensive posture, cataloging evidence with the efficiency of someone trained to assess threats and respond accordingly. "Clayton, how wonderful to see you," Charles replied smoothly, dabbing his mouth with his napkin. "Congratulations on another excellent meal, though I have to say, the service has been somewhat lacking tonight." Clay's gaze never left his sister's face. "Vivian, are you all right?" The simple question, asked with such gentle concern, nearly broke her resolve to hold everything together. Clay had always been her protector, even when they were children. He had taught her to ride a bike, scared away bullies, and held her when their father died too young. He had walked her down the aisle at her wedding because no one else could have filled that role, though she now wondered if he had seen warning signs even then. "She is fine," Charles answered for her, his tone sharp with the authority of ownership. "And I would appreciate you returning to your kitchen so we can finish our anniversary dinner in peace." Something shifted in Clay's expression, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes that Vivian had seen only once before, during their father's funeral, when a drunk mourner had made inappropriate comments about their mother's grief. It was the look of a man whose patience had reached its absolute limit. "Sir," Clay said, and the single word contained volumes of restrained violence, "I was not speaking to you." The tension at the table crackled like electricity before a storm. Charles set down his fork with deliberate precision, the small clink against his plate somehow more ominous than if he had thrown it across the room. Around them, the restaurant had grown so quiet that the sound of waves against the rocks below seemed unnaturally loud. "Excuse me," Charles asked, his voice carrying the dangerous edge of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. "Did you just tell me what I can and cannot say about my own wife?" Clay's hands remained steady at his sides, but Vivian could see the subtle shift in his stance, the way his weight balanced on the balls of his feet like he was preparing to move. She knew that stance from their childhood, from the countless times he had positioned himself between her and whatever threatened to hurt her. "I asked my sister a question," Clay replied evenly. "I would like to hear her answer." "Your sister?" Charles laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Let me explain something to you. Chef, when a woman gets married, she becomes part of her husband's family. Her loyalty, her obedience, her very identity belongs to him. Vivian is my wife, which means she answers to me, not to some glorified short-order cook who thinks wearing Chef Whites makes him important." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Vivian watched her brother's face, seeing the muscle in his jaw twitch once, twice, before going perfectly still. She had seen Clay angry before, had watched him lose his temper as a teenager and young man. But this was different. This was the cold, calculated fury of someone who had learned to channel rage into deadly precision. "Charles, please," Vivian whispered, finally finding her voice. "Let's just go home." "We are not going anywhere," he snapped, turning his attention back to her with renewed viciousness. "You wanted to make a scene in front of your brother, fine. Let him see exactly what kind of wife he raised you to be." Charles leaned forward across the table, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the now silent restaurant. You have been nothing but a disappointment since the day I married you. Weak, emotional, constantly complaining about every little thing. I thought pregnancy might make you more grateful, more feminine, but instead you have become even more pathetic. Each word hit Vivian like a physical blow, designed to strip away whatever confidence she had managed to gather. She could feel the baby moving restlessly inside her, responding to her stress and elevated heart rate. The doctor had warned her about this, about how maternal distress could affect fetal development and potentially trigger early labor. You think carrying my child gives you some kind of power over me? Charles continued, his voice growing louder as he sensed her weakness. Let me remind you of something. Sweetheart, I own you. I own this pathetic little life you think you have built. Your job, your apartment before we married, your car, your clothes, everything you touch belongs to me. And when this baby comes, I will own them too. That's enough. Clay's voice cut through Charles's tirade like a blade through silk. Charles straightened in his chair, his face flushing with indignation. I beg your pardon. I said that's enough. Clay took a single step closer to the table, and somehow that small movement seemed to fill the entire space around them with potential violence. You will not speak to my sister that way in my restaurant or anywhere else. Your restaurant, Charles laughed again, and this time the sound was genuinely amused. Do you have any idea who I am? Do you understand what I could do to this little vanity project of yours with a single phone call? He pulled out his phone and held it up like a weapon. I have connections you cannot even imagine. Health inspectors, fire marshals, liquor licensing boards, food critics who could destroy your reputation overnight. I could have this place shut down by morning and ensure you never work in this industry again. The threat was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had wielded such power many times before. Charles Edward Whitmore III came from the kind of old money family that owned judges, bought politicians, and crushed opposition with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. He had never encountered a problem that could not be solved with money, influence, or intimidation. But as he looked into Clay's eyes, something cold and predatory looked back at him. You know what I think, Clay said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather or the evening specials. I think you have never been in a fight in your entire life. I think you have spent so many years picking on people who cannot fight back that you have forgotten what real danger looks like. He moved closer, each step measured and deliberate. The other diners were no longer even pretending to eat, phones out and recording as the confrontation escalated beyond anything they had ever witnessed in person. I think, Clay continued, his voice never rising above a normal speaking level, that you hit my pregnant sister because you knew she could not hit you back. I think you threaten and intimidate and bully because deep down, you are the weakest, most pathetic excuse for a man I have ever encountered. Charles shot to his feet so quickly that his chair toppled backward, crashing to the floor with a sound like breaking bones. How dare you speak to me like that? Do you know who my family is? Do you understand what we can do to people like you? People like me, Clay asked, and for the first time, something resembling a smile touched the corners of his mouth. You mean people who have actually fought for something that mattered? People who have put their lives on the line for something bigger than their own ego? People who know the difference between real strength and the pathetic power trips of spoiled children? He was close enough now that Charles had to look up to meet his gaze, close enough that the difference in their physical presence was unmistakable. Clay had spent years in combat zones, had trained his body and mind to function under the kind of pressure that would break most people. Charles had spent his years in boardrooms and country clubs, soft and safe and utterly unprepared for this moment. Here's what's going to happen, Clay said quietly. You are going to apologize to my sister. You are going to leave this restaurant, and you are never going to touch her again. Charles's face had gone from red to purple, veins standing out on his forehead as rage and humiliation warred for control. You cannot tell me what to do. She is my wife, my property. I will do whatever I want with her, and there is nothing you or anyone else can do to stop me. The admission was captured by a dozen phones, recorded in high definition and uploaded to social media before Charles even realized what he had said. In his fury, he had stripped away all pretense and revealed exactly who he was for the world to see. Property, Clay repeated, and now his voice carried something that made several people near them push back from their tables. "Did you just call my pregnant sister your property?" That was when Charles made his final, fatal mistake. Perhaps it was the wine, or the adrenaline, or simply a lifetime of never facing consequences for his actions. But he reached out and pushed Clay's chest with both hands, trying to shove him away from the table. "Get away from us, you worthless piece of trash. Take your military hero complex and get out of my sight before I have you arrested for harassment." Clay did not move. Charles might as well have been pushing against a mountain for all the effect his shove had, but something in the restaurant's atmosphere changed. Like the moment before lightning strikes, when every hair on your body stands up and the air itself seems to hold its breath. Clay looked down at the hands pressed against his chest, then back up at Charles's face. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the room with perfect clarity. "Sir, you have just made the biggest mistake of your life." For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, the entire restaurant held its breath. 50 witnesses watched as Clay stared down at Charles's hands pressed against his chest, then slowly, deliberately, looked back up into the other man's face. The silence was so complete that the sound of Vivian's sharp intake of breath seemed to echo off the walls. Charles, perhaps finally realizing he had crossed a line he could not uncross, tried to step backward. But Clay's hand moved with liquid precision, closing around Charles's wrist and holding him in place with the kind of controlled strength that spoke of years of training and absolute confidence. "Remove your hands," Clay said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to giving orders in life or death situations. "Now!" The word hit Charles like a physical blow. Whatever bravado he had summoned by pushing Clay evaporated as he found himself unable to break free from the iron grip holding his wrist. For the first time in his privileged life, Charles Edward Whitmore III was physically overpowered by someone who would not be intimidated by his name or his family's influence. "Let go of me," Charles demanded, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear he was trying to hide. "This is assault. I will have you arrested." "You put your hands on me first," Clay replied matter-of-factly, still holding Charles's wrist with effortless strength. "In front of 50 witnesses with phones, after striking my pregnant sister in my restaurant, I would say my response has been remarkably restrained so far." Travis Burns emerged from the kitchen then, moving with the same purposeful efficiency as Clay. At 29, Travis had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before joining Clay in civilian life, first as a sous chef and now as his business partner. He took in the scene with a single glance and positioned himself strategically near the kitchen entrance, ready to control access and backup if needed. "Everything all right out here, chef?" Travis asked, using the tone that indicated he already knew everything, was decidedly not all right, and was prepared to act accordingly. "Just having a conversation with Mr. Whitmore about restaurant etiquette," Clay replied without taking his eyes off Charles. "He seems to be having some difficulty understanding the basic concepts of respect and appropriate behavior." Maureen Kelly, the restaurant manager, had been watching the confrontation unfold from her position near the hostess stand. At 45, she had seen every type of difficult customer imaginable, but nothing had prepared her for this level of open violence and intimidation. She had already called the police, her hands shaking as she provided details to the dispatcher. "Mr. Grace," she called out, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "The authorities are on their way." Charles's face went pale as the implications hit him. Police meant reports, reports meant records, and records meant his carefully maintained public image would be shattered beyond repair. His family's lawyers were good, but they could not undo video evidence of him striking a pregnant woman in front of dozens of witnesses. "This is ridiculous," he blustered, finally managing to pull his wrist free from Clay's grip. "I was defending myself against this maniac. He threatened me. He assaulted me." "Actually," said a clear voice from a nearby table, "I recorded the entire incident. Would you like me to play it back?" The speaker was an elderly woman dining alone, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her eyes sharp with intelligence. She held up her phone with the confidence of someone who had witnessed injustice and refused to let it stand unchallenged. "As did I," added another diner, a young man who looked like he might be a journalist or blogger. "Posted it live to my social media accounts. 60,000 followers so far, growing by the minute." The color drained entirely from Charles's face as he realized the scope of his exposure. In the age of viral videos and instant global communication, his moment of uncontrolled rage had just been broadcast to the world. There would be no covering this up, no using family connections to make it disappear. "You do not understand," he said desperately, looking around the room as if searching for allies who would never come. "She is my wife. This is a private family matter. You have no right to interfere." "I understand perfectly," Clay replied, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining something to a child. "You hit my pregnant sister in my restaurant. You threatened her, called her your property, and then put your hands on me when I intervened. There is nothing private about public assault, and there is nothing familial about abuse." He stepped closer, and Charles instinctively backed away, bumping into the overturned chair behind him. "Here is what you clearly do not understand. I spent 8 years in the Navy SEALs. I have been trained to neutralize threats with maximum efficiency and minimum collateral damage. Right now, in front of all these witnesses, you represent a clear and present danger to my sister and her unborn child." Clay's voice never rose above conversational level, but something in his tone made everyone in the restaurant understand they were witnessing a predator deciding whether to attack. "The only reason you are still conscious is because I choose to let you remain so. The only reason you are not currently on the floor with several broken bones is because I respect my sister too much to traumatize her further with unnecessary violence." Charles opened his mouth to speak, but Clay raised a single finger that stopped him as effectively as a shout. "But understand this very clearly," Clay continued. "My restraint has limits. If you ever, and I mean ever, lay a hand on my sister again, if you threaten her, intimidate her, or cause her one moment of fear or pain, I will forget about legal consequences and civilian rules of engagement. I will hunt you down and teach you exactly what 8 years of special operations training can accomplish when applied with personal motivation." The threat was delivered with such calm certainty that several diners actually pushed back from their tables, instinctively creating distance from the controlled violence radiating from Clay's still form. Charles tried to speak again, but found his mouth dry and his voice gone. "Do you understand me?" Clay asked. Charles nodded wordlessly, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "Good. Now you are going to apologize to my sister, and then you are going to leave this restaurant. Security cameras and witnesses have recorded everything that happened here tonight. If I were you, I would contact a very good lawyer and prepare for the legal consequences of your actions." Vivian had been sitting frozen throughout the confrontation, her hands pressed protectively over her pregnant belly as she watched her brother transform into someone she barely recognized. She had known Clay was dangerous, had understood intellectually that his military training made him capable of violence most people could not imagine. But seeing him in action, watching him dominate a situation through sheer force of will and controlled intimidation, was both terrifying and deeply reassuring. "Charles," she said quietly, her voice stronger than it had been all evening, "I think you should leave." He turned to look at her, his face a mask of confusion and rage. "You are taking his side against your own husband." "I am taking the side of someone who has never hit me," Vivian replied, and the simple statement carried more weight than any accusation. "I am taking the side of someone who protects me instead of hurting me." The sound of sirens could be heard approaching in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Charles looked around the restaurant one final time, seeing only hostile faces and recording devices documenting his complete humiliation. "This is not over," he said, his voice shaking with impotent fury. "You have no idea what you have started here, no idea what I am capable of." Clay smiled then, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Actually, I have a very good idea what you are capable of. I have seen you in action tonight. You are capable of hitting a pregnant woman and running your mouth when you think you are safe. What I am curious about is whether you understand what I am capable of." Charles had no answer for that. As the police sirens grew louder and the reality of his situation began to sink in, he turned and walked quickly toward the restaurant's exit, leaving behind his wife, his reputation, and any pretense that he was anything other than a coward who preyed on those weaker than himself. But as he reached the door, he turned back one final time, his eyes finding Vivian across the crowded dining room. "This is not over," he repeated, and this time the threat was unmistakable. Not by a long shot. to Ranonum. Detective Vernon Walsh arrived at Coastal Kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been working domestic violence cases for the better part of 2 decades. At 52, he carried himself with the bearing of a veteran who had seen humanity at its worst and still chose to fight for its best. His gray hair was cropped short. His brown eyes held the kind of tired wisdom that came from too many nights like this one, and his presence immediately commanded respect from everyone in the restaurant. Walsh had been a Marine before joining the police force, which meant he understood exactly what he was looking at when he saw Clay standing protectively near his sister's table. Military bearing was unmistakable, especially in a crisis situation, and the detective could read the controlled violence in Clay's posture like a roadmap. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walsh announced to the restaurant, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to taking control of chaotic situations. "I am Detective Walsh with the County Sheriff's Department. I understand there was an incident here tonight involving domestic violence. I am going to need everyone to remain calm while I gather information." Maureen approached him immediately, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the evening's events. "Detective, I am the manager here. I called 911 after witnessing Mr. Whitmore strike his pregnant wife. The entire incident was captured on our security cameras, and several customers recorded it on their phones." "Thank you, ma'am. I will need copies of all available footage." Walsh's eyes moved to Vivian, who was still seated at the table, one hand pressed to her reddened cheek and the other protectively covering her pregnant belly. "Mrs. Whitmore, I presume I am going to need to speak with you about what happened here tonight." Vivian looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of fear, shame, and something that might have been hope. "It was not that bad," she said automatically, the words coming out before she could stop them. "I mean, he was upset about something, and I probably should not have talked back, and maybe I misunderstood, ma'am." Walsh interrupted gently, his voice carrying the patience of someone who had heard these exact words countless times before. "You have a handprint on your face, and 50 people witnessed your husband strike you. There is no misunderstanding to be had here." Clay stepped forward, his protective instincts triggered by his sister's attempt to minimize what had happened. "Detective, my name is Clayton Grace. This is my restaurant, and Vivian is my sister. What we witnessed tonight was not a misunderstanding or a domestic dispute. It was clear-cut assault by a man with a documented history of intimidation and control." Walsh turned his attention to Clay, taking in the military bearing, the controlled anger, and the obvious expertise in handling dangerous situations. "Mr. Grace, I appreciate your concern for your sister, but I need to hear her account of events directly. However, I would like to speak with you separately about what you observed and how you responded." That was when Dorothy Grace arrived, bursting through the restaurant's front door with the focused determination of a mother whose child was in danger. At 58, Dorothy retained the brisk efficiency of her nursing career and the fierce protectiveness that came from raising 2 children largely on her own after her husband's early death. "Where is she?" Dorothy demanded, her eyes scanning the restaurant until she found Vivian still seated at the table. "Oh, honey, what did he do to you?" The appearance of her mother seemed to break something loose in Vivian's carefully maintained composure. For the first time since the slap, tears began to flow freely as she stood and moved into Dorothy's embrace, her pregnant form awkward but desperate for the comfort and safety her mother represented. "I am sorry," Vivian whispered against her mother's shoulder. "I am so sorry for all of this. I should have been more careful. Should not have said anything. Should not have made him angry." "Stop," Dorothy said firmly, pulling back to look into her daughter's eyes. "This is not your fault. Do you hear me? Nothing you said or did justifies what happened here tonight." Walsh watched the family reunion with the clinical eye of someone trained to observe human behavior under stress. He had seen this pattern many times before: the victim's initial attempt to minimize the abuse, the family's protective response, and the complex dynamics that made domestic violence cases so challenging to prosecute successfully. "Mrs. Grace," he said, addressing Dorothy, "I assume someone called you about the incident." "Maureen called me," Dorothy replied, never taking her eyes off her daughter's face. "I am a retired nurse. Detective, I know what stress and trauma can do to a pregnant woman. We need to get her to a hospital for evaluation." As if summoned by her words, Vivian suddenly gasped and doubled over, her hands clutching her abdomen as a sharp pain shot through her midsection. The baby, which had been moving restlessly all evening, suddenly went completely still. "Something's wrong," Vivian said, her voice tight with pain and fear. "The baby. Something's wrong with the baby." Clay was at her side instantly, his arm supporting her weight as she struggled to remain upright. "We need to get her to the hospital now," he said, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who understood that every second could matter. "I am calling an ambulance," Walsh said, already reaching for his radio, but Dorothy shook her head. "My car is right outside, and the hospital is only 5 minutes away. An ambulance will take longer to get here than it will take us to get there." She looked at Clay with the expression of someone making a battlefield decision. "Can you carry her?" "Of course." Clay was already moving, scooping Vivian into his arms with the easy strength of someone who had carried wounded comrades to safety. "Travis, take care of things here. Maureen, send copies of everything to Detective Walsh." As they headed toward the door, Walsh called after them. "Mrs. Whitmore, we still need to discuss what happened here tonight. This investigation is not going away just because you are having a medical emergency." Vivian looked back at him over Clay's shoulder, her face pale and drawn with pain. "I understand, Detective, but right now, I need to make sure my baby is all right." They were almost to the exit when Charles reappeared, flanked by a woman in an expensive suit who could only be his lawyer. Eleanor Blake Whitmore shared her brother's aristocratic features, but carried herself with the sharp competence of someone who cleaned up other people's messes for a living. "Where do you think you're going with my client's wife?" Eleanor demanded, stepping into their path with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way through legal intimidation. Clay did not slow down or acknowledge her presence in any way. He simply adjusted his grip on Vivian and continued moving toward the door with the implacable momentum of a force of nature. "Get out of my way," he said quietly. And something in his tone made Eleanor instinctively step aside despite her legal training and professional bravado. Charles, emboldened by his sister's presence and the protection of legal representation, tried one final power play. "Vivian, you will come home with me right now. We can handle this medical situation privately, with our own doctor, without involving the authorities or making this circus any worse than you already have." Vivian lifted her head from Clay's shoulder and looked directly at her husband for the first time since he had struck her. When she spoke, her voice was weak from pain, but absolutely clear in its resolve. "I am not going anywhere with you, Charles. I am going to the hospital to make sure our baby is safe, and then I am going to decide what happens next. But I will never, ever put myself or this child in a position where you can hurt us again." The words hit Charles like a physical blow. For the first time since the incident began, he seemed to understand that his actions might have consequences beyond legal troubles and public embarrassment. He might actually lose control of his wife, his child, and the carefully constructed life that depended on his ability to dominate and intimidate. "You cannot leave me," he said, and for the first time all evening, he sounded genuinely desperate rather than angry. "Vivian, we can work this out. I was under stress. I had too much to whine. I lost my temper. It will not happen again." But Clay was already pushing through the restaurant's doors, carrying his sister toward Dorothy's car and away from the man who had spent 3 years systematically destroying her sense of self-worth and safety. As they reached the parking lot, Vivian was hit by another wave of pain, this one strong enough to make her cry out. The baby, which had been moving constantly throughout her pregnancy, remained ominously still. "Drive fast. Mom," Clay said as he gently placed Vivian in the back seat and climbed in beside her. "I think we might be running out of time." Behind them, Charles stood in the restaurant's doorway, watching the car disappear into the night and realizing that his world as he knew it was ending. Tomorrow, the videos would be everywhere. His family would demand explanations he could not provide. His business associates would distance themselves from the scandal. And somewhere in the chaos of consequences and recriminations, he had lost the only real power he had ever possessed, his wife's fear. Detective Walsh remained in the restaurant, methodically collecting evidence and witness statements, building a case that would ensure Charles Edward Whitmore III faced justice for his actions. But as he worked, he could not shake the feeling that tonight's incident was just the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous. In his experience, men like Charles did not simply accept defeat and move on. They escalated. They retaliated. They found new ways to hurt the people who had dared to stand up to them. And somewhere in the night, A decorated Navy SEAL was preparing to protect his family by any means necessary. The emergency room at Coastal Regional Medical Center buzzed with the controlled chaos of a Saturday night. But Dr. Sarah Chen took one look at Vivian's pale face and elevated stress levels and immediately moved her to the front of the triage line. At 34, Dr. Chen had delivered hundreds of babies and handled countless pregnancy emergencies. But something about this case triggered all her protective instincts. "Mrs. Whitmore, I am Dr. Chen. I understand you experienced some trauma this evening, and you are concerned about your baby." She spoke with the calm efficiency of someone trained to project confidence, even in crisis situations. Vivian nodded, wincing as another wave of cramping pain shot through her abdomen. "The baby was moving constantly during the incident, but now I cannot feel anything, and these pains started right after." She could not bring herself to say the words, "after my husband hit me," in front of a stranger. "After the domestic violence incident," Dr. Chen finished matter-of-factly, making notes on her tablet. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to understand that stress-induced pregnancy complications are very real and very serious. What happened to you tonight was not only criminal, it was potentially life-threatening to both you and your child." Clay stood against the wall of the examination room, his arms crossed and his expression grim. He had been silent during the intake process, but Dr. Chen could see the controlled fury radiating from his still form. She had treated enough military families to recognize the signs of someone trained for violence working very hard to maintain control. "Mr. Grace, I assume," she said, turning to address him directly. "The patient's brother." "Yes, ma'am. Clay Grace. I own the restaurant where the incident occurred." His voice was steady, but Dr. Chen could hear the underlying tension. "Doctor, is the baby going to be all right?" "We are going to do everything we can to find out. First, I need to get Mrs. Whitmore connected to a fetal monitor so we can assess the baby's heart rate and movement patterns. Then we will do an ultrasound to check for any signs of placental abruption or other trauma-related complications." Dorothy had been holding Vivian's hand throughout the examination, her nursing training helping her interpret the medical terminology and procedures. "Doctor, my daughter's blood pressure has been elevated throughout this pregnancy. Her obstetrician has been monitoring it, but given the stress of tonight's events, I am concerned about preeclampsia or early labor." Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. "You are absolutely right to be concerned. Domestic violence is one of the leading causes of pregnancy complications, and the stress hormones released during traumatic events can trigger a cascade of problems for both mother and baby." As if to emphasize her point, Vivian suddenly gripped the examination table's rail and doubled over as another contraction hit. This one was stronger than the others, lasting nearly a minute and leaving her breathing heavily when it finally subsided. "That felt like real labor," Vivian whispered, fear evident in her voice. "But I am only 7 months along. It is too early. Mrs. Whitmore, we are going to admit you for observation and treatment. I want to get you on medication to stop these contractions and monitor you and the baby closely for the next 24 to 48 hours. Dr. Chen's tone was reassuring but serious. "The good news is that even if we cannot stop the labor completely, babies born at 32 weeks have excellent survival rates with proper medical care." The word survival hit the room like a physical blow. For the first time since the incident began, Vivian fully understood the potential consequences of Charles's actions. This was not just about bruises or hurt feelings or damaged relationships. Her husband's violence had put their unborn child's life at risk. "I need to call Charles," she said automatically, reaching for her phone. "He should be here. He needs to know what is happening with the baby." Clay stepped forward immediately, his hand gently covering hers to stop her from making the call. "Viv, you do not need to do that right now. You need to focus on getting yourself and the baby stable." "But he is the father," Vivian protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "He has a right to know." "He lost his rights when he put you and the baby in danger," Clay replied firmly. "Right now, the only thing that matters is your health and safety." Dr. Chen looked between the siblings, reading the family dynamics with the expertise of someone who had navigated countless similar situations. "Mrs. Whitmore, legally speaking, your husband does have certain rights regarding medical decisions and information about his child. However, given the documented domestic violence incident, we can implement safety protocols that prioritize your well-being." That was when Eleanor Blake Whitmore appeared in the doorway. Having somehow talked her way past hospital security, she wore the expression of someone accustomed to gaining access to restricted areas through sheer force of legal intimidation. Mrs. Whitmore, I am Eleanor Blake Whitmore, your husband's attorney and sister. I need to speak with you about the events of this evening and coordinate your medical care with your family's preferred physicians. Clay moved to block Eleanor's entry into the room, his body language making it clear that she was not welcome. She is not going anywhere or speaking to anyone until the doctors clear her.